how good are these lands? We're going to take a look at that right now. So these are an example of the new cycle of rare dual lands that we're getting with Murders at Karlov Manor. In this set, we're getting the full cycle of all 10 of these lands. And these lands are very interesting because they do come into play tapped all the time, but outside of that, these have a lot going for them, and they seem pretty divisive right now. Some people think they kind of suck because they come into play tapped all the time, and other people think that they're great. And me personally, in short, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I think these lands are very good, and I think a lot of people might be sleeping on them right now. So let's take a look at exactly what do these lands do. They come into play tapped. When they enter the battlefield, you surveil one, and they have the two corresponding basic land types to their colors. So there are a few cycles of dual lands we've had in the past that you could compare these two pretty closely. First, we've got the cycle of temples from the Theros block. These ones always come into play tapped, and when you enter the battlefield, you scry one. However, these do not have the basic land types. There's also this common cycle from Dominaria United. These also come into play tapped, but they do have the basic land types. And then there's this cycle from Amonkhet block. These also come into play tapped. They have the basic land types, but with these, you can pay 2 and cycle them. So first, let's compare the new lands to the temples here. So both of them always come into play tapped. With the temple, you scry one when it comes into play. However, with the new lands, you surveil one, and then also these have the basic land types. And it might not look like a huge difference, but these new lands are way better than the temples. These kind of put the temples to shame for a few reasons. The first one, obviously, is these have the basic land types, so that immediately kind of just makes them better right away. But also, the fact that you surveil one instead of scrying one is also pretty huge. Scrying one fixes your next draw. Surveilling one does much more than that. Because say, for example, you're playing a deck that has cards like this in it maybe, that have the flashback ability. Well, if you were to scry, you could just put this card on top or bottom of your deck. If you surveil, though, you could put this card in your graveyard, and then since it has flashback, you have access to casting that card. This is essentially drawing you a card just by playing your land. Or maybe you're not playing things with flashback. Maybe you're playing with cards in standard that care about having things go to the graveyard. Something like this with the descend mechanic. Scrying wouldn't help that at all, but surveilling definitely does. If you put a permanent from the top of your library into your graveyard, you've descended, so now you can turn on your descend triggers. Or maybe you have cards like this that care about having things in your graveyard, so you're not necessarily casting stuff from your graveyard, but cards like Souls of the Lost, which get bigger for having more permanents in your graveyard. Or you could be playing cards with escape in formats other than standard, like maybe Croxa here, which sees play in modern sometimes. And yes, I do think these lands are modern playable. So the fact that it surveils instead of scries is a big deal. What if we compare it to Contaminated Aquifer here? This one doesn't scry or anything. It comes into play tapped, but it does have the basic land types. So obviously this one is going to be better than this common cycle of lands because, you know, these are commons. They're good in limited, but people do play these outside of limited. These are actually quite popular for Commander as budget lands simply by nature of having the basic land types here. That's just how important having basic land types is, and these lands do have those. Mainly that's useful because you can find these with cards like fetch lands. You can get it with things like 3 Visits or Nature's Lore. But also, coming back to Standard again, there is a mechanic in Standard which cares about having basic land types in Domain here, and there are several cards with Domain that see play, one of the big ones here with Leyline Binding. So no longer will you have to be playing common lands like this just to get your basic land types. You can get a huge upgrade and play the rare land cycle now instead. Now let's compare it to Fetid Pools here. So Fetid Pools, out of the three comparisons we're making, I would say is the best one, this cycle of rare dual lands out of the Amonkhet block. These ones, they have the basic land types, they come into play tapped, but you can cycle them for 2, so they have some very significant added utility. And this card, when it was in Standard, did get upwards of about $10. People played it quite a lot, and it held value even after rotating out of Standards. Even today, this is still worth a couple dollars. And I do think the new rare dual lands are significantly better than this other cycle of lands. So these ones are very similar, but I think Surveilling 1 is much better than Cycling 2. Because, as we mentioned before, you can use it with cards like this, and these cards can get you actual card advantage, whereas Fetid Pools, this never gets you card advantage. This only really ever gets you card selection, because you cycle this, you put it in your graveyard, and you draw a card. So you've basically swapped your Fetid Pools for one new card, just replacing itself. However, with Undercity Sewers, when you put this into play, your land is now in play, and you can Surveil 1 and set up the top card of your deck, maybe get some extra value if you have something that cares about putting things in the graveyard, you have something with flashback or something like that, but your land is now in play. So you've gotten that extra value, and you have your land in play, rather than cycling it away to the graveyard with things like Fetid Pools. But that's just the case of just straight up using these lands on their own. Where this really shines, I think, is when you combine it with fetch lands in a format like Modern, because you can fetch this land into play and get immediate value. That's something that puts it way above something like Fetid Pools here, because in order to get value from this, you have to cycle it from your graveyard. If you fetch it into play, you have a land into play that comes into play tapped. That's it. With this one though, you get to Surveil 1, and this is very relevant even in decks that don't care about any graveyard synergies. You don't have to be playing any of these cards in your deck in order for this to be good. Because in Modern, I've had this happen many times, and I'm sure many of you have as well, where say the game starts, I'm on the play, I have a Fatal Push in hand, I play my fetch land and pass the turn, and then just leave up my Fatal Push planning to kill whatever the opponent plays. But then they just don't play anything, so I have no turn 1 play. So normally what I would do is go, okay, end of turn, I'll fetch, I'll put my shock land into play tapped, and then it comes back to my turn. But now what I could do, instead of just getting a shock land into play tapped, I could fetch, get an Undercity Sewers, put that into play tapped, just like my shock land would have been, but then I get to Surveil 1 and set up my next draw step. So in this specific case, the Undercity Sewers is actually significantly better than the Watery Grave would have been. Now keep in mind, that's in this specific situation. I'm not saying Undercity Sewers is better than Watery Grave. These are not better than shock lands, but there are situations in which they can be better. And I think that extra utility will lead to these being played in formats like Modern. I kind of see these right now as being similar to the Triomes when those first came out, because when these were spoiled, people looked at them, saw they come into play tapped all the time, and they were like, they're fine, they're not great. People slept on these cards. I did as well, but now this is one of the most popular cycles of rare dual lands, and a lot of these are $20 plus. And I think this new cycle of rare dual lands is similar to these because they always come into play tapped, but they have the basic land types. It's different from the Triomes because Triomes have 3 and these have 2, but these give you a lot of extra added utility. I feel like this is definitely something Wizards of the Coast has done on purpose, printing these lands in this set, because in the past, shock lands and Ravnica have gone hand in hand, and shock lands are some of the best lands that you can get. These are not shock lands, but these are very good, and I think that these are gonna kind of shake up the way a lot of decks build their mana bases. So basically, to summarize, I think these new lands are much better than these. They're not as good as these, but they're kind of similar to these in a little bit of a strange kind of way. So let me know in the comments below What do you think of this new cycle of rare dual lands? Do you disagree with me on any of these points? I definitely could be wrong on evaluating these cards. I have been wrong on evaluating many cards in the past, but I think these are pretty good. But let me know your thoughts regardless. Anyway though, if you're still watching, thanks for watching. It'd be cool if you can like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. I'd encourage everyone to come join my Discord server. You can find a link to that in the video description below. And also, you can see this nice playmat that I've been using. This playmat is available for purchase on the 8th Place Dave and Snug the Amazing store, which you can find linked in the video description below as well. There you can also buy cool things like these Hash Up Oasis sleeves, and you can get some hand-drawn custom tokens even as well. And they do ship worldwide. And also, I'd just like to take a moment to thank all of the patrons that support me on Patreon. But otherwise though, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.